We are here at Netroots Nation in St. Louis, Missouri on the 0 hour. We are, in fact, inaugurating some new technology. We are broadcasting live on Facebook, and we are also recording for our YouTube channel and our program. And joining us now is Howard Park. He's going to help us set the scene a little bit for St. Louis itself, the city, its history, its politics, and what people can expect as they enter and engage with the city as part of Netroots Nation. So first of all, Howard Park, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to have Netroots Nation here. I grew up here in St. Louis and worked for one of the local congressmen, and we have a lot of history that a lot of people aren't familiar about on the progressive side here, both probably positive and negative over the recent history and beyond that.
Well, tell us a little bit. I mean, obviously, one of the things people think of nowadays when they think of progressive politics and St. Louis is they think of Ferguson and the problems we've experienced there, the struggles we've experienced there. I think one of the things that people need to understand is that, some of the root causes for the police community conflict we see in Ferguson, they're not restricted to Ferguson, are they? I mean,
absolutely not, of course. One of the things that characterizes St. Louis, like a lot of areas in the Midwest and all over the country, is that we have an incredible number of something like 200 local government bodies, and that doesn't even count the water district or the school boards. Like, I know when you come into the airport here in St. Louis, between when you go to the airport and then you rent a car and then you go hit the highway, you're in about 10 different municipalities. And the way a lot of these towns have financed themselves over the years is simply to harass local residents. There's something like in Ferguson, which was not the worst offender, there's something like 40%, and I'm in the ballpark, but I might be off on the specifics, are done through fines and traffic fines of the people in the local community. And it really sets up an us against them dynamic, which would be there anyway with all the divisions in our society, with race and with class and income. But there's even more of it in a place where you've kind of let the little local governments run wild. And that is part of the real, there have been study after study about what a problem it is. Some areas like Indianapolis have made progress, but and people like small local governments. There are some benefits of that, but in Ferguson has really brought out some of the really negatives in that the police have been set off against the community for 50 or 100 years.
Yeah, I think that's really important for people to understand. And zooming out a little bit to St. Louis as a whole, I see for those folks who are watching on Facebook or later on YouTube, your T-shirt, you tell me, is actually the flag of St. Louis. Now it shows it's orange field, 3 wavy blue lines intersecting it. That symbol is a fleur-de-lis, if I'm not mistaken. So intersecting it at a fleur-de-lis. What does it represent?
Well, this represents the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, and then, of course, the Missouri joins the Mississippi at St. Louis and flows down to New Orleans. But that's obviously a big part of the history here. And
the fleur-de-lis because it was settled by the French, I assume?
Right. Across the river was an English colony in Illinois, going back forever, really. But of course, the largest Native American settlement was actually right here in the Mississippi region in around the year 1000 in Cahokia, which is in Illinois, right across the river. But now we're here in St. Louis, and we have a lot of background, and it's both positive and negative.
So St. Louis has a long progressive history, which I think people are probably not that aware of. What are a couple things people ought to know about progressive politics in St. Louis, either now or in the past?
Well, one thing that I like to tell people about that isn't as well known is how we've done the success really we've had in St. Louis with refugees. In the 1990s, in the early 1990s, there were about 30,000 Bosnians that, of course, who are Muslim, tend to be a more secular brand of Muslim, but as part of the genocide in Serbia and Kosovo and Bosnia, many people came here. Our longtime mayor, is a Syrian American, and 30,000 Bosnians, more than any other city, more even than in Chicago, came here to settle in mostly in South St. Louis in a neighborhood called the Bevo Mill. And it was kind of a tired neighborhood. It wasn't really a bad neighborhood, but it had a lot of older people, and that area has really been revitalized over the last 10, 20 years. Bosnians have spread throughout the St. Louis area. There are still more Bosnians here in St. Louis than anywhere except Bosnia. More than Chicago. We don't beat Chicago in much. We beat Chicago in baseball. That's usually just it. And this year, not even that so much. And
both good cities for the Blues, also, by the way.
Yeah,
probably
that's right.
Healthy competition there at one time.
We have the St. Louis Blues Museum just down the street.
Right, I'm going to check it out. Trust me.
Right, but that's one thing that people aren't aware of is some of the success that we've had with immigration. And our mayor, actually, Francis Slay, has actually asked for more Syrian immigrants to come to St. Louis. He's from a Maronite Christian family, which is one of these Christian sects that is pretty beleaguered these days in Syria between the government and ISIS and everybody else. And he's asked for more refugees to come here. And we have experience settling refugees here from the 1990 and other areas. But, of course, the national government and all the publicity has not been helpful. And there's only been a tiny trickle, maybe 1% of the Syrians that want to settle here compared to the Bosnians that settled here 20 years ago. And again, we haven't had any great outbreak of terrorism.
Well, no, of course not. You got a lot of fear-mongering there. As we were saying before the show, and we're talking with Howard Park, political activist, long time, native born to St. Louis here. My hometown of Utica, New York, has been a refugee resettlement center for some time. There are a number of Bosnian refugees there. The old church on Main Street is now a mosque. It's a very peaceful, thriving community. Also, by the way, in Utica, about 3,000 Cambodians as well, so thousands of Vietnamese. So people don't realize how refugee resettlement, if handled correctly, revitalizes a community.
That's right. Like when I grew up here in the 60s and 70s, we had 10 international consulates here in St. Louis. Now we have none. Partly because other areas have done a better job of becoming diverse and reflecting the country that we have. Places like even Kansas City, a pretty similar city, but there's more diversity in Kansas City. There's more Hispanics. And, of course, St. Louis was built by German immigrants and Irish, of course, and we need to get back to that if we're going to rebuild St. Louis. The population here hit a peak in 1950 of about 800,000, and now it's down to a little over 300,000. It's a drop.
And what was it, the 1950s? You said it was 800,000, you said?
That's right.
Yeah, so, okay, my hometown lost about 50% of its population.
Right.
That's why we have it's getting repopulated by refugees. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And before we go, Howard Park, to just let folks know here, what should they be, what might people want to see besides the Blues Museum? What might people want to know over the next 4 days here in St. Louis, if they're not from here?
Well, probably a lot of people are curious about Ferguson, I would think. And to be perfectly honest, I can't think of a tourist site. We have a great botanical garden, but that's not in Ferguson. Ferguson is a working-class suburb. My mom used to drive through Ferguson, used to live about 2 suburbs over, and drove through every day. And if you listen to Donald Trump's speeches, you might think Donald Trump has repeatedly, many times, referred to Latino gangs in Ferguson and how he called, just a couple of weeks ago, he called Ferguson one of the most dangerous places in the world. Think about it, in the world. But the truth is, if you go to Ferguson, you won't see any Latino gangs, even if you want to, because there just really aren't any Latinos there. I mean, people are African American or white.
So you mean to tell me that Donald Trump lied about something? Shocking.
Maybe we just misinterpreted what he said or something. I wouldn't want to be unfair to him.
Well, of course, he says Latino because he wants to create hatred against immigrants of all kinds.
Even if the immigrants aren't there.
And even if the immigrants have been living in this country as many generations as his family has, as was the case with his attacks on the judge, who he described as a Mexican judge. The guy was born in the Midwest.
Right, in Indiana, just a little ways over. That's exactly right.
That's right.
And so that's one thing you won't find in St. Louis, but if you did go up to Ferguson, I mean, you would see a lot of, I'll tell you, there's some nice houses there. There's also some poverty, like any
Sure.
Anywhere else, there's a lot of fast food restaurants. There's a few local restaurants, but you will not find, if you're worried about Latino gangs, you will not find them in Ferguson, no matter what Donald Trump has told you.
Well, we are forewarned then, and unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Howard Park, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you. It's a great opportunity. And welcome everybody to St. Louis.